Sometimes the cruelest rejection arrives without a raised voice, only a message on a screen that quietly tells you where you no longer belong. I had already packed my suitcase. It stood beside the front door with a bright blue luggage tag that my grandson had picked out for me the previous Christmas because he said it would help everyone find Grandma's bag faster. I smiled every time I looked at it. At 68 years old, I had never been on a cruise before. Daniel had spent weeks telling me how beautiful the ocean would look at sunrise and how excited the children were to eat ice cream whenever they wanted. Olivia had even asked whether I preferred a room near the middle of the ship because it usually felt steadier on the water. Every conversation made me believe I was part of the trip. That Tuesday afternoon, I was folding my favorite navy sweater into the suitcase when my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. I expected another reminder about boarding times or parking at the cruise terminal. Instead, I saw my son's name followed by a message so short that I read it 3 times before my mind accepted the words. Mom, I am really sorry. Olivia thinks it would be better if this trip is just immediate family. Please do not come. We will make it up to you another time. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. Then I touched it again, hoping I had misunderstood something. The words did not change. I quietly sat down at the kitchen table with the phone still in my hand. The house around me was completely silent except for the steady ticking of the old wall clock that had hung there since my late husband installed it nearly 30 years earlier. Somehow the silence felt louder than any argument ever could. I looked toward the suitcase by the door and noticed the travel folder resting on top. Inside were my passport, printed confirmations, and a handwritten list of things I still needed to pack before Saturday morning. I had even bought a comfortable pair of walking shoes because Daniel said we might spend hours exploring ports together. Suddenly, those shoes seemed like they belonged to someone else's vacation. I did not call him immediately. I did not send an angry reply. Instead, I placed my phone face down on the table and slowly poured myself a cup of coffee that I no longer wanted. I kept asking myself the same question. How had I become someone who no longer counted as family? My husband passed away 9 years earlier, and since then Daniel had been my closest relative. I never wanted to become the kind of mother who interfered with his marriage or expected to be included in every holiday. I respected boundaries. I always called before visiting. I never offered advice unless someone asked. When Olivia joined our family, I welcomed her with genuine affection because I believed loving my son also meant loving the woman he had chosen to build a life with. Even after they had children, I tried my best to help without becoming a burden. Yet as I sat there staring at that message, a strange realization settled over me. This was not really about a cruise. The cruise was simply the first time someone had put my place in the family into writing. I opened the message one more time and noticed something I had overlooked before. Daniel had written, Olivia thinks it would be better. He had not written, we think it would be better. One small word carried the weight of an entire relationship. I closed my phone, walked quietly to the front door, lifted the suitcase by its handle, and carried it back into my bedroom. I did not unpack it. I simply placed it in the corner beside the closet and looked at it for several long moments. Something told me that before I decided what to do with that suitcase, I first needed to understand how the family I had spent a lifetime protecting had quietly learned to leave me behind. After putting the suitcase back in my bedroom, I returned to the kitchen and sat quietly beside the window until the coffee in my mug turned cold. I could have called Daniel immediately. I could have demanded an explanation or insisted that he tell me exactly what had changed. Instead, I did what I had done through most of my life whenever something painful happened. I allowed myself time to think before speaking. As the afternoon sunlight slowly faded across the hardwood floor, memories began arriving one after another, not because I wanted to revisit them, but because they seemed determined to remind me how our family had reached this moment. 9 years earlier, when my husband passed away after a brief illness, Daniel was only 33 years old. He sat beside me after the funeral and promised that we would always look after each other. I believed him because he had always been a thoughtful son. Even as a little boy, he worried more about other people than himself. If I came home tired after working a double shift at the hospital, he would quietly wash the dishes without being asked. If a neighbor needed help carrying groceries, he was already halfway across the street before anyone else noticed. Raising him had never felt like a burden. It had been the greatest privilege of my life. After college, he struggled to save enough money for a down payment on his first home. Housing prices kept climbing, and every month seemed to push ownership farther away. I still remember the evening he nervously admitted that he and Olivia were thinking about postponing their wedding because they could not afford both a house and the ceremony they had planned. I did not hesitate for even a second. My husband and I had spent decades building savings for retirement, and after he passed away, I realized I no longer needed as much as we had planned together. A few weeks later, I sold the small lake cabin that my husband had loved every summer. It was not an easy decision because every room held memories of our family vacations, fishing trips, and quiet evenings watching sunsets over the water. But I told myself that memories belonged in people, not buildings. The money from that sale became the foundation for Daniel and Olivia's first home. They cried when I handed them the cashier's check. Daniel hugged me so tightly that I could barely breathe, promising he would never forget what I had done. Olivia thanked me over and over again, saying I had given them the opportunity to begin their future without overwhelming debt. I never considered it a sacrifice. I considered it an investment in my family. As the years passed, I continued helping whenever I could. I babysat the children. Whenever daycare closed unexpectedly, I prepared Thanksgiving dinner almost every year because everyone said my recipes made the holidays feel complete. When Olivia returned to work after their youngest child started kindergarten, I spent afternoons picking the children up from school so they would not need expensive after-school care. I attended school plays, soccer games, birthday parties, and piano recitals with genuine happiness, never expecting recognition because simply being included was enough. Looking back, I realize I measured my life by the moments our family shared together rather than by anything I owned. That was why Daniel's message hurt so deeply. It was not about missing a vacation. It was about discovering that somewhere along the way, I had slowly stopped belonging in the future I had spent years helping them build. As evening settled outside my window, I picked up my phone once more and reread the message without allowing emotion to rewrite its meaning. Then I opened the family photo album resting on the bookshelf beside the fireplace. The smiling faces looking back at me reminded me of everything we had once been. I quietly closed the album and wondered when those photographs had become memories instead of promises. The next morning I woke earlier than usual, though I had barely slept. Daniel's message remained on my phone exactly where I had left it, unread since the night before, not because I had forgotten about it, but because I already knew every word by heart. I decided not to call him. I wanted to see whether anyone in the family would notice my silence before I filled it with questions. Instead, I followed my normal routine. I watered the flowers on the back porch, read a few chapters of my book, and drove to the grocery store. Everywhere I went, life continued exactly as it always had. Children laughed in the parking lot, neighbors waved as they walked their dogs, and cashiers smiled while asking whether I had found everything I needed. The ordinary world carried on without realizing that mine had quietly shifted. Later that afternoon, my granddaughter called through a video chat using her mother's phone. Her cheerful smile immediately brightened my screen. "Grandma, are you excited for the big boat?" she asked. I forced myself to smile just as brightly. "I was very excited," I answered gently. Before I could say anything else, Olivia appeared in the background and politely ended the call, explaining they were busy packing. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, yet one small detail stayed with me long afterward. My granddaughter had asked whether I was excited, not whether I was coming. That meant she still believed I would be there. She had not been told anything different. For the first time, I wondered who actually knew about Daniel's message and who did not. The following day, my sister, Helen, called to ask whether I wanted to carpool to the cruise terminal because she thought it would be easier than driving separately. I paused for several seconds before quietly telling her that I would not be joining the trip after all. There was complete silence on the other end of the line. "What do you mean you are not coming?" she asked with genuine confusion. I repeated Daniel's message almost word for word. Helen sounded stunned. She insisted that everyone had been talking about the cruise for months as though I would be there with them. She even reminded me that Daniel had mentioned reserving a dining table large enough for the whole family during last Thanksgiving dinner. After we ended the call, I realized something important. My absence was not part of the original plan everyone believed they understood. Somewhere between those early conversations and the week before departure, something had changed. That evening, I opened the drawer where I kept birthday cards, holiday photographs, and handwritten notes from years gone by. I found a postcard Daniel had mailed me during his honeymoon. On the back he had written, "No matter where life takes us, you will always be the heart of this family." I traced the faded ink with my fingertips and quietly smiled, not because the words still felt true, but because I remembered the young man who had sincerely believed them when he wrote them. People rarely change overnight. They drift one decision at a time, often without noticing how far they have traveled. I placed the postcard back inside the drawer, closed it gently, and looked toward the suitcase still waiting in the corner of my bedroom. I suddenly realized that the cruise itself no longer mattered. What mattered was understanding when my place in the family had quietly become optional, and why no one had thought I deserved to hear it face to face. 2 days before the cruise was scheduled to depart, I stopped wondering whether I had been excluded at the last minute. Instead, I began noticing how many quiet moments had prepared me for that message long before it ever arrived. Looking back, the signs had been there all along. I had simply mistaken distance for busyness because that explanation was easier to accept. A few months earlier, Daniel and Olivia celebrated their wedding anniversary with a dinner at a restaurant they had always loved. I found out about it only because my grandson proudly showed me a family photograph the following weekend. He innocently pointed at everyone sitting around the table and asked whether I liked the picture. I smiled and told him it was beautiful, never mentioning that I had not known the dinner had taken place. At the time, I convinced myself it had probably been a last-minute decision. Then there was my birthday in the spring. Daniel called to wish me a happy birthday, and the children sang over the phone. But later that evening, I noticed photographs online from a family barbecue held the very same day. Once again, I created excuses on their behalf. They must have been busy. Perhaps they assumed I already had plans. Perhaps they simply forgot. Every explanation protected them while quietly diminishing my own feelings. Now those memories no longer stood alone. They lined up beside one another like pages in a book I had never taken the time to read. The cruise was not the beginning. It was only the first time someone had actually said the quiet part out loud. On Thursday afternoon, my neighbor Carol stopped by with a basket of fresh blueberry muffins. She knew I had been planning to travel because we had talked about the cruise several times while tending our gardens. When she asked what time I was leaving for the port on Saturday morning, I hesitated before telling her the truth. She looked genuinely surprised. "I thought your whole family had been excited for you," she said softly. "So did I answered with a gentle smile that felt heavier than I intended. Carol reached across the kitchen table and rested her hand over mine for a brief moment. She did not criticize Daniel or Olivia. She simply reminded me that being excluded often says more about the people making the decision than the person being left behind. Her kindness stayed with me long after she returned home. That evening, I opened my desk drawer and found the travel folder I had packed so carefully only a few days earlier. Airline confirmations were never inside because we had planned to drive together to the cruise terminal before boarding the ship as one family. I slowly removed the luggage tags, folded the printed itinerary, and placed everything back into the folder without throwing any of it away. I was not ready to erase the evidence that, until recently, I had truly believed I belonged on that journey. Before going to bed, I looked through my phone one more time. There were dozens of photographs of school concerts, holiday dinners, beach vacations, and ordinary Sunday afternoons. In almost every picture, I was standing behind the camera instead of in front of it because I was usually the one making sure everyone else fit into the frame. I suddenly wondered how many memories I had helped create without ever realizing how easy it would become for those same memories to continue without me. As I set my phone on the nightstand, another thought quietly settled into my heart. I no longer needed to discover whether I had been left out of one vacation. I needed to understand whether I had slowly been disappearing from my own family for much longer than I had been willing to admit. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and the kind of crisp autumn air that usually made me eager to begin a new adventure. Instead of driving toward the cruise terminal, I carried my suitcase back into the hall closet and closed the door quietly behind me. I told myself there was no reason to keep looking at something that no longer belonged to my plans. Around 10 o'clock, my phone chimed with a message from my cousin Rebecca. She had intended to send a photograph to another relative, but my name appeared in the group by mistake. Before she realized the error, the picture had already appeared on my screen. It showed nearly everyone gathered near the cruise terminal entrance, smiling beneath a large welcome sign with colorful luggage stacked around them. Daniel stood beside Olivia with one arm around her shoulders while the children waved excitedly toward the camera. My eyes slowly moved across every face until I noticed the empty space near the edge of the group. It was exactly where I would normally have been standing. A second photograph followed only a few moments later. Someone had written, "The whole family is finally together." I looked at that sentence much longer than I looked at the photograph itself. Rebecca called almost immediately after realizing what had happened. She apologized over and over, clearly embarrassed that she had sent the pictures to me. I assured her that none of this was her fault. Before ending the call, she hesitated and quietly said something that stayed with me. "Margaret, I honestly thought you had chosen not to come. Everyone was talking as though you had decided to stay home." After we hung up, I sat in my living room thinking about those words. No one believed I had been excluded. They believed I had declined the invitation myself. That meant the story surrounding my absence had somehow changed before the ship ever left the dock. I opened Daniel's message again and compared it with Rebecca's explanation. Somewhere between those two versions, the truth had been replaced by a much more comfortable narrative. Later that afternoon, my sister Helen called from the ship while everyone else was attending a welcome activity. She had stepped away onto a quieter deck because she wanted to check on me. "Something feels strange," she admitted softly. "When I asked Daniel why you stayed home, he simply said you needed some quiet time for yourself." Olivia nodded, and then everyone changed the subject. I thanked Helen for telling me and asked her not to argue with anyone during the trip. There was nothing to gain from turning their vacation into a family dispute. After we ended the call, I made myself a simple lunch and carried the plate onto my back porch. The neighborhood was peaceful. A gentle breeze moved through the maple trees while children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. For the first time since receiving Daniel's message, I noticed that I was no longer waiting for my phone to ring. I had stopped expecting an explanation to arrive on its own. Instead, I began writing down every moment I could remember when I had quietly accepted being overlooked. The anniversary dinner, my birthday barbecue, holiday plans I learned about afterward, the cruise. Each event seemed small by itself, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. As evening settled across the yard, I closed the notebook resting on my lap and looked toward the fading sunlight beyond the fence. I realized I was no longer searching for proof that I had been left behind. I already had that proof. What I needed now was the courage to understand whether the silence I had accepted for so long had encouraged everyone else to believe I would always accept one disappointment after another without ever asking why. The cruise was somewhere out on the ocean by Monday morning, but my thoughts were no longer following the ship. They had finally returned home, where they belonged. I spent the morning organizing old family papers that had been sitting untouched inside a cedar chest for years. There were birthday cards from Daniel's childhood, school report cards I had proudly saved, handwritten Mother's Day notes, and photographs that captured decades of ordinary happiness. Looking through them did not make me angry. It made me realize how easily we assume love will always remain exactly as we remember it. Relationships rarely change all at once. They change one conversation, one decision, and one unspoken disappointment at a time. Around noon, my cousin Rebecca called again from one of the cruise ports. This time her voice sounded more hesitant than before. She explained that during dinner the previous evening, someone had mentioned how unfortunate it was that I had decided not to come. Before anyone else could continue the conversation, Daniel quietly replied that I had wanted some time to myself and preferred staying home. Rebecca admitted that several relatives seemed surprised because they remembered how excited I had been only weeks earlier. No one argued with Daniel, but according to her, the table became noticeably quieter after that. I thanked her for being honest with me and reminded her that she did not need to take sides. She paused before saying something that caught my attention. "Margaret, I do not think everyone knows the same story." After ending the call, I sat quietly on my back porch with a notebook resting on my lap. For several minutes, I simply watched autumn leaves drift across the yard. Rebecca's words continued echoing in my mind. Different people believed different versions of my absence. Some thought I had chosen to stay home. Others believed I had become ill. A few apparently knew nothing at all. The only people who certainly knew about Daniel's message were Daniel and Olivia. That realization changed the way I viewed everything that had happened. The silence surrounding my absence had not appeared naturally. Someone had allowed different explanations to spread without correcting them. Later that afternoon, My sister Helen called while the ship was preparing to leave another port. She sounded thoughtful rather than upset. I spoke with Daniel this morning, she told me gently. I asked him whether you were feeling all right because everyone misses you. I waited quietly for her to continue. He did not mention Olivia at all. He only said that staying home had probably been best for everyone because it made things simpler. I closed my eyes for a moment after hearing those words. Simpler. It was such an ordinary word, yet it carried an unexpected weight. For the first time since receiving the text message, I stopped focusing on the sentence Daniel had written about Olivia wanting immediate family. Instead, I found myself thinking about the decision itself. Whether the idea had started with Olivia or not suddenly mattered less than the fact that my own son had accepted it and defended it afterward. No one had forced him to press the send button on that message. No one had required him to let relatives believe I had willingly stayed home. Those had been his choices. That evening I made myself a cup of tea and opened the notebook where I had been collecting my thoughts since the cruise began. I drew a simple line down the center of one page. On one side, I wrote the things I knew for certain. On the other side, I listed assumptions that I still could not prove. When I finished, only one name appeared repeatedly under the facts rather than the assumptions. Daniel. I closed the notebook with a quiet sense of clarity. The disappointment I had been carrying was no longer directed toward a misunderstanding or a vacation. It was directed toward the painful realization that the person I had spent a lifetime protecting had made a choice that left me standing outside my own family. And before this story could ever move forward, I knew there was only one conversation that truly mattered. The morning after the cruise returned to port, I woke with an unexpected sense of peace. For the first time in days, I did not reach for my phone hoping to find an explanation waiting for me. I already understood the most important part of the story. Whatever reasons had been offered, whatever excuses had been repeated, my place in the family had been treated as something optional instead of something valued. That realization hurt, but it also gave me clarity. After breakfast, I drove to the office of my attorney, not because I wanted revenge or because I planned to punish anyone. I simply wanted to update documents that I had not reviewed since my husband passed away. Life changes, and responsible people prepare for those changes. My attorney welcomed me warmly and asked what had brought me in after all these years. I explained that I wanted my estate plan to reflect the life I intended to build moving forward instead of the life I had been assuming would always remain the same. We reviewed every document carefully: beneficiaries, charitable donations, personal property, and medical directives. I made thoughtful decisions without anger. I chose to leave meaningful gifts for my grandchildren because they had done nothing wrong. I also established a scholarship donation at the local community college where my husband had once taught evening classes. When the meeting ended, I felt lighter than I had in months. It was not because I had taken something away from anyone. It was because I had finally made decisions based on reality instead of expectation. On my way home, I passed the community center where a sign outside advertised a weekly book club for local residents. Normally, I would have driven past without giving it another thought, but this time I pulled into the parking lot and walked inside. The volunteer at the front desk greeted me with a warm smile and explained that new members were always welcome. She introduced me to several people close to my own age who immediately invited me to join their discussion the following Tuesday evening. I accepted before I had time to overthink the decision. That simple conversation reminded me how long it had been since I had allowed myself to become part of something that existed only for my own happiness. During the following week, I also registered for a watercolor class at the local arts center, something I had postponed for years because I was always helping someone else with school pickups, holiday meals, or weekend errands. Every new commitment felt unfamiliar at first, yet each one quietly reminded me that my life had never been meant to exist only in the empty spaces left by other people's schedules. One afternoon, my neighbor Carol stopped by with fresh flowers from her garden. She smiled when she noticed several library books resting on my coffee table and asked whether I had finally joined the reading group she had recommended months earlier. When I nodded, she laughed softly and said, "It looks good on you." We spent nearly an hour talking about books, travel, and places we still hope to visit someday. As she drove away, I realized that the loneliness I had feared after the cruise never truly arrived. What had arrived instead was room for new friendships and forgotten dreams. That evening, I opened the closet where my packed suitcase had been waiting since the day Daniel sent his message. This time I did not look at it with sadness. I rolled it into the hallway, brushed away a thin layer of dust, and placed it beside the front door once again. The destination would be different, and the people traveling beside me might be different as well, but I no longer believed that my happiness depended on being invited into someone else's plans. Before turning off the lights that night, I glanced at a framed family photograph on the mantel. I smiled gently, not because everything had been repaired, but because I finally understood that loving my family did not require forgetting my own worth. Whatever conversation waited with Daniel after he returned home, I knew I would face it calmly, with honesty, and with the quiet confidence that comes from remembering who you are even after someone else forgets. 3 days after the cruise ended, my doorbell rang just after lunch. I looked through the front window and saw Daniel standing on my porch with his hands in his coat pockets. He looked older than he had only a week before, as though something during the trip had quietly settled on his shoulders and refused to leave. For a brief moment, I simply stood there, remembering the little boy who used to run through this same front yard after school, eager to tell me everything that had happened during his day. Then I opened the door. "Hello, Mom," he said softly. "May I come in?" I stepped aside without saying another word. We sat across from each other at the same kitchen table where I had spent so many afternoons helping him with homework years ago. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. Eventually, Daniel looked down at his hands and took a slow breath. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not because the trip happened, but because of the way I handled everything." I listened quietly without interrupting. "The message should never have been a text," he continued. "You deserved a conversation. You deserved honesty." I nodded gently. "You are right." He looked relieved that I had answered, yet I could see he understood that agreeing with him was not the same as forgiving him. After another long pause, he admitted something I had quietly suspected ever since Helen called me from the ship. "Olivia had concerns about the vacation," he said carefully. "She worried that old family dynamics would make the trip stressful. But the decision to send that message was mine. I could have said no. I could have insisted we find another solution. Instead, I chose what I believed would avoid conflict, and in doing that I created a much deeper one. Those words mattered more to me than any explanation he could have offered. For the first time since receiving the message, I felt as though I was speaking to my son instead of someone hiding behind another person's opinion. I folded my hands together on the table before answering. "Daniel, I was never hurt because I missed a cruise. Vacations end after a few days. What stayed with me was the feeling that my place in this family had become negotiable." He lowered his eyes without speaking. "When you told everyone I decided to stay home, that hurt even more. It made my absence look like my choice instead of yours." He closed his eyes briefly before whispering, "I know." We sat together in silence for several moments. There was no anger left in my voice, and I no longer needed to prove anything. I spent many years believing that if I kept giving enough of myself, our family would always stay close. I continued. "But healthy families do not depend on one person constantly making sacrifices. They depend on honesty." Daniel nodded slowly. "I understand that now." He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small envelope on the table. Inside was a framed photograph taken during the cruise. The children had written a short note on the back telling me they missed me and wished I had been there. I smiled sadly as I read their handwriting. "They asked about you every day," Daniel admitted. "I should have told them the truth from the beginning." I carefully returned the photograph to the envelope and placed it beside my coffee cup. "The children never needed an apology from me," I said gently. "They needed honesty from the adults." Daniel looked at me with tears beginning to form in his eyes. "Can you forgive me?" he asked quietly. I thought about the question for several seconds before answering. "Yes," I said. "I can forgive you because carrying resentment would only hurt me. But forgiveness is not the same as pretending nothing happened. Trust returns slowly, one honest decision at a time." He nodded without arguing because he knew those words were fair. As he stood to leave, he hugged me longer than he had in many years. I returned the embrace with genuine affection, yet I also understood something that brought me unexpected peace. This conversation was not the ending of my story. It was simply the beginning of a healthier chapter, one built on truth instead of quiet assumptions. Several months have passed since Daniel stood in my kitchen and admitted that the decision had been his. Life did not suddenly return to what it had been before the message arrived, and I no longer expected it to. Some things can be repaired, but they are never restored by pretending the damage never happened. Instead, they become stronger only when everyone is willing to acknowledge where the cracks first appeared. I continued attending the Tuesday evening book club and discovered that I genuinely enjoyed discussing stories with people who had once been strangers. I finished my watercolor class and even entered one of my paintings into the community center's annual exhibition. To my surprise, it received an honorable mention. It was not the ribbon that mattered. It was the realization that I still had new chapters waiting for me, even at 68 years old. Daniel kept his promise to rebuild trust one step at a time. He called every Sunday afternoon without fail, not because he felt obligated, but because he wanted to know how I was doing. Sometimes we talked for nearly an hour about ordinary things such as gardening, books, or the children's school projects. Other times the conversations lasted only a few minutes. Either way, they were honest, and honesty had become more valuable to me than perfect words. Olivia also reached out several weeks after the cruise. She asked whether we could meet for coffee. I accepted because I believed respectful conversations are always worth having. She admitted that she had allowed small frustrations to grow into unfair assumptions and that instead of discussing those feelings openly, she had chosen distance. I thanked her for her honesty, but I also explained that rebuilding relationships requires consistent actions rather than a single apology. She agreed without trying to defend herself. Over time, we learned to be polite, thoughtful, and respectful toward one another again. We were not trying to recreate the past. We were creating something healthier than the version we had quietly allowed to drift apart. The greatest joy came from my grandchildren. They never stopped seeing me as grandma. We baked cookies together on rainy Saturdays, read books in the living room, and planted tomatoes in my backyard garden every spring. They cared far more about laughter than family disagreements, and spending time with them reminded me that love does not disappear simply because adults make poor decisions. One afternoon, my grandson noticed the blue luggage tag that still hung from my suitcase in the hall closet. He smiled and asked whether I had ever taken the cruise I wanted. I smiled back and told him not yet. Then he said something that made me laugh. We should plan a better trip next time. His simple confidence reminded me that the future is never limited by the disappointments of the past. A few weeks later, I finally used that suitcase. It was not for a cruise. Several friends from the book club organized a week-long tour through New England during the autumn, and I decided to join them. As our bus traveled along winding roads lined with brilliant red and golden trees, I looked out the window and realized how peaceful my heart had become. I was no longer measuring my happiness by invitations I did not receive. I was building a life filled with opportunities one chose for myself. Looking back now, I understand that the text message which once felt like the end of my place in the family became the beginning of something I never expected. It taught me that love should never require someone to make themselves smaller just to remain included. Families grow stronger through honesty, respect, and kindness, not through silence or quiet sacrifice. I still love my son, my daughter-in-law, and my grandchildren with all my heart. But I also love the woman I became after finding the courage to value herself. Sometimes the greatest journey is not the vacation you miss. It is the road that begins the moment you decide your worth will never again depend on someone else's invitation.